serving organization or business. And then we're going to kick things off. Welcome to breakout session number 2, the American Rescue Plan and COVID recovery. Where are we and what is next? My name is Allison Rose Sokol. I'm the Assistant Director of P12 Policy at the Education Trust, and I'm so glad you've all joined us today. You'll see some of my amazing colleagues down here at the bottom of the screen, and I will introduce them later in our session. Okay, so a little overview of where we're headed for today. I will talk about what the American Rescue Plan is, what can and states be doing with this unprecedented investment in education from the federal government to advance equity, talk a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing in states' plans to spend their ARP dollars, and then we'll have a really great panel discussion with 3 of our Ed Trust state directors about how they have been advocating and will continue to advocate for their state and districts to effectively and equitably use these dollars to meet the needs of students. And hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for Q&A. The American Rescue Plan. How did we get here? So very briefly, in March of 2020, Congress passed the CARES Act, which provided a little more than $30 billion for education. And then in December, another act which provided $82 billion for education. And then most recently, in March of 2021, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which I'll shorten to ARP for this presentation, which provides almost $125 billion for K-12 education, as well as some additional funding for nutrition and childcare. Funding is distributed to states and school districts based on the share of Title I money that they receive under ESSA. States can keep up to 10% of the money they receive, but 90% of the money is going to flow directly to eligible school districts. Under the law, states have to meet a maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity requirement, which in short means that they have to protect tiny districts from disproportionately being impacted by any funding or staffing cuts in difficult economic times. And one of the most interesting and promising aspects of the American Rescue Plan are the set-asides for evidence-based strategies to address unfinished learning. So states have to set aside 5%, and districts have to set aside at least 20% of this very large amount of money that they're receiving to spend on evidence-based strategies to help accelerate students' learning, something we'll talk about more later in the session. And there are also some smaller set-asides for the state to use on summer programs and after school. So how much money is your state going to receive from the federal government to invest in education and help support COVID recovery? We've created a map to help you answer that question. The link is here, but my wonderful colleague, Kayla Patrick, who's on, will also put it in the chat. So I'm going to encourage everyone to go to the map, hover over your state, and you'll see 3 pieces of information, but the one we're focused on is that last piece right now, total K-12 education relief funding. So if you were in North Carolina, you would see that you would be getting $5.6 billion. So once you find your state, share in the chat, how much money is your state getting in K-12 education relief funding? I encourage you to put your state too, so we know how much money we're talking about. I'm seeing big numbers here. Kayla says California is getting $23 billion. Hi, Sue. Sue says Maryland's getting $3 billion. Thank you, Jonathan. $19 billion. If nothing else, the big takeaway here is we're talking about a lot of money and a lot of opportunity to do a lot of good for the students that we care deeply about. So there are some key dates and timelines to keep in mind. States have already received at least 2/3 of their ARP dollars. To receive that last third, states have to submit a plan, an application to the U.S. Department of Education. All states have now submitted their plans, and I believe as of today, 41 states' plans have been approved. Once states get the money, they then have 60 days to make sure it gets to school districts. And then the school districts have to do two things. First, within about a month of receiving the funds, they have to release what's called a return to in-person instruction plan, which talks about how they're going to make sure students can safely return to school. And then within 90 days of receiving the funds, districts have to submit to the state a plan talking about how they're going to use this money to meet the social, emotional, and academic needs of students, especially students most impacted by the pandemic. And the funds must be used by September 30th, 2024. I'm going to pause there and mention that throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them as I see them, or we can come back to them at the end. So has the U.S. Department of Ed approved your state's plan? The link is here, but it's long, so I will rely on Kayla again to put it in the chat, and I'm going to encourage everyone to go to this link from the U.S. Department of Ed. You'll see on the left a column that has the states, and you should be able to find your state and see whether your state's plan has been approved or whether it's still pending. And it's also a good resource so you have access to your state's plan at a later date. Once you find your state, put in the chat your state's name and whether it's approved or whether you're still waiting for the folks at the U.S. Department of Ed to take a look at what your state has said they'll do with that money. I see some folks have put their Washington's still pending. Indiana's has been approved. I'll mention, and we'll talk about through the rest of this presentation, that even the 41 states' plans that have been approved, there are still many, many opportunities to influence how that money is spent. We will talk more about this later in the presentation. So how can the money be used? The use of funds guidance that the Department of Ed put out makes it pretty clear that it can be used very flexibly. There's obviously those set-asides I talked about that states have to use to address the impact of interrupted instruction, to meet students' social, emotional, and academic needs. But the money can also be used for physical reopening, to improve facilities, including improving air quality, to purchase education technology, to provide mental health services and supports, to hire more counselors, and many, many other activities authorized under the law. It's important to note that the law is really clear. States and districts have to engage in meaningful stakeholder engagement to make the decisions about how these dollars are spent. But what should states be doing? That's what they can do with the money, but what should they be doing? We've put together two resources with our national partners to answer that very question. Kayla, if you wouldn't mind sharing these two resources in the chat. One has some recommendations, and the other is actually to be released this week, has a compilation of resources from us and our partners talking about how states can spend the money and encourage districts to spend the money to advance equity. But at a high level, here are our 5 recommendations. 1, use the money to ensure equity in fiscal policies. That means and includes making sure that the money flows equitably to schools so that the schools serving the most students of color and most students from low-income backgrounds get the money they need to meet students' needs. 2, meaningfully engage stakeholders like us in decisions about how this money will be spent. And we know that means more than an English-only online survey or an email to a couple of well-established organizations. 3, target those resources to create safe and equitable learning environments and provide the supports particularly systematically underserved students need. 4, and we're going to dig into this one in a little bit, use the money to implement evidence-based programs that help accelerate students' learning, like tutoring and expanded learning time. And 5, use the money not just to address students' immediate needs, but to lay the groundwork for long-term change. That is tricky. We could spend a whole nother session talking about the balance between making sure we don't have fiscal cliffs and making long-term change, but it absolutely can be done. So one of the recommendations I want to dig into for just a few minutes, something EdTrust has been particularly focused on, is making sure that this money gets used in one of the ways that evidence shows can be most impactful, and that is providing strategies that address students' unfinished learning. So we know that the pandemic disrupted all students' education, but that is particularly true for our most underserved students, students of color, students from low-income backgrounds. And that's not just because of interrupted instruction. Students experienced increased food and housing insecurity, may not have had reliable access to the technology they needed to participate in virtual learning, and may not have had access to the services and supports that are much more readily available when kids are in buildings. And as a result of all that, there's lots of research coming out and data showing that students will have a lot of unfinished learning that is exacerbating or potentially exacerbating existing inequities. But there's reason to be optimistic. Research is really clear that things like tutoring and extended learning time, either where students are working one-on-one or in a small group with a tutor who's using a skill-building curriculum to target their needs, the things that they're missing so that they can engage in grade-level content, or providing really rich extended learning time opportunities can help students catch up and catch up quickly, and can also be ways to help students build meaningful, deep relationships with adults in buildings, which research and our common sense tells us is really important for learning. If you are interested in learning more about this, we published 3 briefs in partnership with MDRC on tutoring, expanded learning time, and the importance of strong relationships. The link is here, and Kayla will share it in the chat. And we also published some guidance with some of our partners specifically for states on implementing tutoring. What are we seeing in states' plans so far? Are we seeing all of these things we're hoping to see? Well, we're seeing some good things and some areas for improvement. We'll start with the areas for improvement because it's nice to end on a good note. So we unfortunately see that many states are not requiring or encouraging districts to equitably allocate their funds to schools. We're seeing that the plans are still very high level, which honestly is an opportunity for further advocacy. We're seeing many states have yet to provide really solid guidance to district leaders about how to spend this really large amount of money to make a difference for kids. And we see that there's a lot more work to do in many states to leverage this money to address unfinished learning in the ways that we just talked about. But there are some promising practices that I want to lift up because I'm optimistic that as we see these practices being implemented, other states will take notice. We see, for example, Tennessee's All-Core, which is funding for small group intensive tutoring for underserved students across the state, something I'm hoping Jeannie will talk about later. We see Louisiana has created an Attendance Alliance, which is a statewide partnership with other state agencies to address the problem of chronic absenteeism and make sure that students are in school, engaged in learning. And we see programs like Texas's Vetted Tutor Corps, which is a big initiative to connect districts with well-trained tutors and teacher candidates who have high-quality instructional materials to provide kids with the supports that they need. On the point of unfinished learning, given that we're seeing so many states that could be and should be doing more to spend their money to address unfinished learning and to support districts in figuring out how to implement things like tutoring and expanded learning time, we have created a letter that advocates can send so that with a click of a button, you can send a letter to your state chief demanding that they use their money in evidence-based ways to accelerate students' learning. So I'm going to encourage you to go to the link where the map was, click on your state, and you'll see the letter pop up. And if you fill out the fields, you can click and send a letter to your chief. So if you were in North Carolina, this is what it would look like. Before we turn to our panel, I want to talk a little bit about the next window of opportunity, which is at the district level. So, as I mentioned, 41 states, plans have been approved, which means the money in those states is now flowing to districts, and in the remaining states, the rest of the money will be flowing to districts as well. And so district leaders are working hard to figure out how to spend those dollars. And that is a moment for us as advocates to be thinking about how we can get a seat at the table and influence how districts are spending what is a large amount of money and how it can be leveraged to meet the needs of students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, students with disabilities, and students who have been underserved for far too long. And if you're interested in digging into that more, if you're someone who's active at the district level, we have some resources here for you, questions to ask generally about how the funding will be spent, an action guide focused on English learners because we want to make sure they're not forgotten in this conversation, and a letter that you can send your district leaders about implementing strategies to address unfinished learning. And don't worry, we will make sure you have all these resources at the end. I suspect we're going to be hearing both about state and district advocacy in our panel, so I'm excited to turn our attention there. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then ask them as many questions as I can fit in the short amount of time that we have together. So I have with us 3 of our state directors at Ed Trust, Jonathan Feinstein, our director for Texas, Jeannie Pupo-Walker from Tennessee, and Natasha Ushomursky from Massachusetts. I'm going to remind our panelists, thank you so much for being here, and just ask that you unmute yourself when you're speaking and then mute yourself again so we don't have an echo. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, if I can figure out how to do that. Are your pictures big, or are we seeing the click to share to start your screen?
Seeing click share, click start to share your screen.
That's unfortunate. Okay, I'll work on fixing that and I'll start with the questions. Okay, so my first question for our wonderful panelists. In March of 2021, as I mentioned, federal government allocated $125 billion to states and school districts. What has been your and your partner's biggest focus in the last 6 months as you've been advocating for how your state and district should use these dollars? Natasha, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Such a pleasure to be with all of you today. So I want to say just a couple of words about sort of our work in Massachusetts writ large. First, just to help frame kind of how we entered this conversation. We at Trust Work in Massachusetts really focuses on supporting a collective education equity effort called the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership. The partnership currently encompasses about 40 organizations kind of that serve communities across the state, work with parents, educators, and students, and really have come together to try to advance educational equity in a state that has a pretty stellar overall reputation. But really, once you start peeling back those averages, like in a lot of places, we have huge disparities in opportunity and outcomes. One of our big focus areas since MEEP launched back in 2018 has been on essentially shifting how decisions are made at state and district tables, especially around the use of resources. The first thing that we engaged in was a funding reform effort called the Student Opportunity Act, a buildup that passed in 2019 that invests a lot more money in K-12 schools, especially in our highest need districts, and also requires districts to put together plans for how they would use that funding and to put those plans together with input from community stakeholders. So that piece around community engagement has been core to MEEP's work kind of all along and has been a real priority for us as we've entered this new space where frankly, the needs of students, families, educators are at an all-time high. Capacity is really low, and there's a lot of money on the table, right? And it feels like there's this real opportunity to do better. And so, one of the things that I absolutely love about working with our partners is that we have an amazing group of people to just make decisions that can make decisions together. And when we found out that all of this money was going to be coming down the pike, we developed a strategy with our partners that's really 3-pronged. We decided that we would work on trying to shape how our Department of Education approached this funding, and really the kind of information that they would require districts to report, the kinds of questions that they would put on the application, and the work that would go into making sure that districts were thinking not just about these new federal dollars, but also the state funds that they're getting through our funding reform effort. Parallel to that, we also have been working to influence what districts do directly. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later in this conversation about a toolkit that we released recently, really to support local education leaders and advocates in figuring out how to use this new funding in the most effective way possible to support students and families. And then lastly, we're also continuing to sort of push our legislature to play the oversight role that they're really well positioned to play, and hold oversight hearings to elevate the voices of students, families, educators, in relation to how these resources are used, as well as just in general how the return to in-person schooling is going.
So much, Natasha. Actually, I'm going to go a little rogue in the order that I'm asking. I think this would be a great time, if you don't mind, to talk about the toolkit that you referenced, that has recommendations for how district and school leaders can leverage not just the ARP dollars, but also these Student Opportunity Act dollars. So if you could tell us a little about the toolkit and the impact that you hope it will have in Massachusetts.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, when we were talking with our partners earlier this year about sort of what does education look like post-pandemic, what's the opportunity in this moment, one of the things that we knew was that student needs were going to be, as I said, at an all-time high, right? And yet there was this interruption in school that in a way creates an opportunity to come back, sort of to build back stronger, or I don't like to quote the build back better messaging, but essentially to build back stronger, right? With equity at the forefront. And we work together with our partners to develop recommendations about ways that districts could leverage the funding that they were getting, to build stronger learning environments that really affirm all students. For example, if you were ever going to think about your discipline codes, this is kind of the perfect time to do it, right? Kids in Massachusetts, kids have largely been out of school, away from in-person learning for a lot of students for a year and a half. What kind of learning environment are they going to come back to? How do we think about better aligning what happens for students at home and in school, right? And strengthening that communication between parents who've really had a front row seat to kids' education over the past year and a half, and teachers. What happens with unfinished learning? What are the things that we need to do differently this year? Remember that the need to accelerate kids' learning, that's not a new thing. We've always had kids come in with vastly different levels and vastly different previous experiences. And frankly, our schools have never been good at accelerating kids, right? And so how can we think about this moment differently? How do we need to organize teachers' time to allow them to plan collaboratively? What kind of support do teachers need? What do instructional materials need to look like, both from a culturally responsive perspective and also from the perspective of actually helping teachers scaffold instruction, right? So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to put on the table in this toolkit with ideas. We have different pages in there for these core issue areas that we know are really important to shaping students' learning experiences. And every one of those toolkits pages also includes questions for advocates to ask of their district leaders to make it as easy as possible for folks on the ground to engage with these materials. In terms of how we hope this will be used, we released the toolkit in August. And we actually saw some really nice pickup. We had our Department of Education actually distributed it for us to their mailing list. And the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents did the same thing. So it was great to get it into education leaders' hands. We're currently working on developing a plan for how we can support local district advocates in engaging with these materials, be it a convening or a series of workshops or something along those lines is going to be sort of our next project. One big opportunity we have in our state is that districts will need to revise plans that they put together before the pandemic about how they'll use new state resources. And so we're hoping that the toolkit will fit into that the advocacy around those revisions.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Kayla put the link to the toolkit in the chat, and I'm just going to encourage everyone to take a look at it. It's obviously very relevant and created for a Massachusetts context, but frankly, it's useful in any state. And the questions are very relevant for anyone looking to push their district leaders to think about how those dollars are being used. So thanks, Kayla, for putting it there, and encourage everyone to look. Jonathan, I'd love to turn to you to talk about in Texas. What have you been focused on in the last 6 months or so as you've been pushing for how these dollars should be spent at the state and local level?
Thanks, Allison, and hello to everybody, and especially anybody from Texas who's made it into the session. I mean, if you go back 6 months, I was looking at the calendar, that would have put us like almost exactly at the decision point when lawmakers actually decided to appropriate these federal funds. And so I would start there, that our biggest focus was really helping advocates and policymakers both feel informed about, this federal policy, these federal dollars, the provisions associated with them, but especially just how much money was actually on the table, where it was supposed to go. And I think the urgency to act, kind of knowing that every week, every month that was going by, that these dollars were not reaching districts, or where there was uncertainty that districts would actually have these dollars, was really kind of hampering the planning that's really necessary to do the kind of work at the district level that I think Natasha, just spoke about, and is encouraging in the toolkit. So for at least here in Texas, it was never a given that they would be, one, distributed equitably, right, based on kind of the Title I appropriations through the federal government, that they would be supplemental dollars, right, that they wouldn't be used to, through some mechanism or another, supplant or replace state dollars, or that they would arrive kind of on time. So again, that was where we were just over 6 months ago. And I think, we were just coming off the reality that the first round of those ESSER dollars, that the CARE dollars, not the ARP funds, but that first initial package, were used in Texas not really as supplemental funds. They were basically plugging state funding gaps, especially in a state where we have attendance-based funding, and that attendance was dropping. And so, like, that's where everybody, including EdTrust's focus was. And I think the bigger overarching challenge was really helping policymakers at that time understand the scope and the scale of the challenge, right? Of the disparities that existed before, of the fact that these disparities were widening by the day. And I think also what Natasha said, what our track record was. We saw data that actually I credit TEA for our state agency bringing forward. Historically, we've only been able to bring 5% of students who are behind grade level back up to grade level over the next 2 or 3 school years. So when we think about the lifespan of these dollars, which we only really have 2 or 3 years to spend them realistically, and do some of the transformational work that districts need to do and that the state needs to do, like we got to do something different. We can't just kind of do that. And so it was also the project, I think, of trying to help them not approach this from a fatalistic standpoint. And so we relied on EdTrust research briefs and really our partners to advocate for state policy that would ensure the funds were used to support strategies that we have some evidence and some confidence can actually work, right? Using that student level data to identify the gaps, matching our best teachers with the students who need them the most, expanding the learning day or even the year, providing that targeted high quality tutoring, and equipping teachers with really high quality instructional materials. So that was really especially I think the focus that we took really at the state level. And we can kind of maybe talk later about the work that really needs to be done continuing at that level, but also the 90% of the dollars that are going to districts. I mean, that's where the action is, to be honest, right now.
Someone should write that down and quote you, Jonathan. Before we turn to Jeannie, Jonathan, EdTrust in Texas put out a really great summary of Texas's COVID recovery approach, including what's in the ARP plan. And could you just talk for a minute about why you put that together and why you think it's important for stakeholders to know what your state is doing with this investment?
Yeah, so just like where I left off, yes, a lot of the action is at the district level, but 10% of those federal funds are controlled by the state agency, or I guess up to 10%. And I think the other thing, especially for us as advocates to recognize, is that okay, maybe that's 10% of funds, but these state agencies play a central role in setting the priorities and in organizing a lot of the evidence-based assistance that districts rely on, especially in rural and typically, at least rural in Texas, or smaller districts that usually have less capacity. So they are the state response is really incredibly important to helping our district level decision makers access the right kinds of tools, technical assistance, and to set the strategy. And so that's why we put that together, so that as state advocates we can continue to understand what that plan looks like. We can monitor how those funds are actually getting distributed. So like we're waiting. We know that a bunch of the state dollars were just awarded, but we still haven't seen exactly where it went. So that transparency and equity part is really important for us to continue to keep an eye on, as well as looking at the plan and identifying areas of improvement or where more investment may be needed. And that's what we try to do with the document. But I think most importantly, I think for local advocates, knowing what those state level supports are that are available, tracking that down and seeing, did your district pursue any of those strategies? And so I think that's where we're coming from. Also, because if the state isn't focused on it, that doesn't mean that local districts shouldn't be. And so they can really kind of supplement or kind of think about the gaps that may not be provided by the state, but that are really important in their local context.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Jeannie, on to you. You've been working hard in Tennessee. What has been your and your partner's focus in the last 6 months as you've been advocating for how these dollars and state dollars should be spent?
Well, first I want to say it's such an honor to be with these two amazing, well, the three of you speakers. I always learn a lot from my colleagues here on these panels. So we, Education Trust in Tennessee office opened in January of 2020, right before the pandemic. And we spent a year sort of building a platform and partnerships, borrowed a lot of ideas actually from MEEP. And we launched an alliance, which I'm going to put in the chat here, in January of this year, in 2021, with partners that continues to grow. And so when we saw all of these, so over $4 billion coming to Tennessee for recovery, knowing that that money needed to be spent by 2025, we launched a listening tour this summer that we called TN25, Tennessee 25, to really say what should look different by 2025. What would be different in Tennessee after this money has been expended, after hopefully pandemic is over? Will we see something transformative? Will we see better systems in place for students? Will we see meaningful solutions, sustainable long-term solutions to some of the issues that we have seen way before the pandemic, but certainly exacerbated? And so that listening tour we held, we called it TN25. I'm just going to put another link here in the chat, where we held 12 different listening groups, sessions across the state by region, by roles, students, parents, advocates. East, West, Middle Tennessee had a really interactive platform and heard a lot of interesting things. We asked folks how they felt the money should be spent. We asked them what were their top priorities, top concerns, asked them to name ways they thought we could be solving for some of these problems. And so what came out of that really was some really profound sort of feedback. And of course, we always underestimate what communities and what families and what educators really understand and know to be true for what is necessary. And I will say that in Tennessee, the number one thing that emerged as a top priority in Tennessee is sort of the lack of funding in general and resources for schools. And close second was mental health supports for students. And when we said, please list, prioritize the ways we think. So we said, imagine if you were superintendent for a day, how would you spend these dollars? And the number one thing that every group pointed to was supports for mental health, physical health for students. This was over the summer. before kids were back in school, knowing folks were very worried about how students are doing. Right behind that came, tutoring, intensive services and supports, instructional supports for students, and right behind that was around supports for teachers, training for teachers, and so we know that folks have meaningful, substantive opinions about what should happen with this money. We also did statewide polling, which mirrored a lot of what we heard. We oversampled for Black and Latino parents across the state, and with some differences in thoughts and priorities, but primarily the same thing: deeply concerned about student achievement and student mental health, and really wanting to see prioritization on high yield kind of instructional interventions, after school programs, tutoring, whatever it takes to get students back on track. So our process now is to really pull all of that together, release a report in a few weeks that we hope will frame our conversations going into the next legislative session, where we will say to legislators, not only is this money, pushing, is the money being spent well, but is it being spent on these things we know families and educators and stakeholders believe are necessary? And so we'll continue to hopefully we'll set out some meaningful, measurable goals in the report, what we want to see true by 2025. And then each year is going to come back to that and say, was money spent in these areas? Did it have an impact? Are we seeing the change that we hoped for? And it's a big lift to ask folks to stop and think about how this money should be spent and to find evidence of whether it's working or not. So we're gonna dedicate quite a bit of time to that.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. I'm so excited to read that report. And I imagine will be posted. Will be on Ed Trust in Tennessee's website. Great. And that was actually a great segue. Jeannie started talking about the plans after the release. And so I'd love if you could each, I think we've got, 30 seconds. What is your focus in the coming months? We'll go backwards. Jeannie, anything else that you're focused on in the next few months that you want to share with everyone?
Wait, there we go. How's that? What we're focused on actually is funding reform. Our governor announced on Friday that he is conducting a listening to and a review of our formula. They announced yesterday they're forming 18 subcommittees of stakeholders to give feedback on 18 different topics. So we are going to gather the troops, and we have people that will probably be on every one of those committees. So we'll be prepping them, holding office hours to help them go into those meetings really informed and ready to lead. And then we'll be producing TN25. Those are the two big things.
Thanks, Jeannie. Jonathan, what's your focus in the next few months?
So we're any day now, hopefully, going into what we call interim session. So our legislative cycle has been a marathon, but that really gives us the opportunity to pivot to some of that state level transparency and oversight. In fact, we have state legislation that requires the agency to report back to legislative leaders. So we're going to continue to lean in to make sure that those updates are made public, that there's opportunity for public feedback and participation. And of course, monitoring how some of those state level awards actually went out, who is focused on what with the support of the agency. I think the other thing that is that we're really excited about is just digging in with some of our local advocates to kind of pick up the advocacy and the engagement on the district level plans. And so I know that Allison and Ed Trust National hopefully is going to have something to share about a workshop series. So we want to make sure that that's accessible to all of our local advocates, and that we're really being a good partner to meeting whatever those locally defined needs are, and helping advocates engage in that district level budget setting and priority setting with administrators and with school board members.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good preview. I'll get there in a second. Natasha, what is your focus in the next few months?
So we are actually expecting that our Department of Education will be releasing sort of guidance documents and templates for the next round of district plans for how they will use both their state and their federal funds. We're expecting that those will come out sometime later this fall, and then that plans will be due at some point early next year. And so our focus will be on, once we know what the ask of districts is, right, to try to help, first of all, make sure that districts take the time to engage with their stakeholders and perhaps even help facilitate some of that engagement, and also to just make sure that, you know, both advocates come to the table ready to kind of push for sort of knowing what to push for, right, in these conversations and what questions to ask so that their voices can be heard as districts kind of put together these plans that'll be in place for the next 3 years.
Great. Thank you all so much. As I figure out how to share my screen again for the last few minutes, if you wouldn't mind, will you share your email addresses in the chat? We're short on time. Folks aren't going to be able to ask you all the many questions I'm sure they have, and so would love for them to be able to connect with you. Aha, it worked. Technology success for the day. Okay, with our last 120 seconds of this session, some next steps for all of the amazing participants that have stuck with us. Here's a link to a lot of the resources that we talked about today, but I promise you that they will be sent to you in the follow-up email from boot camp. So if you didn't get all of them in the chat, don't worry about it. Another plug to take a look at that letter. It's a small thing, but it's easy, and I'm all about quick and easy, powerful things to do at the end of boot camp sessions. So that's a letter you can send to your state chief. And as Jonathan mentioned, we are kicking off an unfinished learning workshop series to help local and district advocates learn how to engage in conversations with their district leaders about budget and priorities and how these dollars that are flowing to districts are going to be spent. The very first session in that series will be October 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and the link is there for you to sign up. We'll also be sharing that after boot camp. Encourage you to attend and share it with other folks who are eager to engage in conversations with their district leaders about how to do better for students in the years to come. And finally, don't hesitate to reach out. There's my email address. We have dug into a lot of states' plans, and we'll be looking into promising practices at the district level, and are always happy to connect and support you all in the amazing work that you're doing as equity warriors. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I hope to see you all back on the main stage. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's state time. That's where we're headed next. I hope you all have a great time chatting with folks from your state, and I'll see you tomorrow at on the main stage. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Allison.
Thanks, amazing panel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Good job.